begin. I apologize for the delayed start, but it's a long arc to freedom. Good afternoon, and welcome to From Baltimore to Palestine, Connecting the Dots. I'm Russell Rickford. I teach in the history department here at Cornell, and I'm delighted that you've made it out this afternoon. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the co-sponsors of this program, and they are Legion, and perhaps my co-organizers will help me out if I leave any out. But we'd like to thank the Africana Studies and Research Center, American Studies, the Institute for Comparative Modernities, Comparative Muslim Societies, Ithaca Jewish Voice for Peace, the Multicultural Resource Center, the Ithaca Committee for Justice in Palestine, the Ithaca Democratic Socialists of America, Cornell Students for Justice in Palestine, Black Students United here at Cornell, and the Congo Square Market. Now, co-organizers, who have I left out?
No. Never mind. I think you got them.
Okay. Got me in trouble with this. Now, while all of these organizations may not all agree with all of the perspectives expressed this evening, they staunchly believe in the open and democratic exchange of political ideas. Now, I promise that we will have some vigorous Q&A this evening. But first, I just wanted to show two very, very brief videos. So with my friend Eric's help, just bring down the lights.
When I see them, I see us.
Every 28 hours, a black life is stolen by police or vigilantes in the U.S.
Every 2 hours, a Palestinian child was killed in Israel's attack on Gaza last summer.
Eric Garner, 43 years old, father of 6, grandfather, friend.
Graylan 7 years old, killed when an Israeli missile struck her home.
Hashem Abu Maryam, 45 years old, father of 4, human rights worker.
Ayanna Jones, 7 years old, killed in her sleep by Detroit police.
When I see them,
I see us. Harassed, beaten, tortured, dehumanized.
stopped and frisked, searched at checkpoints.
Administrative detention, youth incarceration. When I see them,
I see us.
from Rikers Island to Ophir Prison.
From Rafah to Chicago.
Lives are being stolen.
Remember them.
We are not statistics. We are not collateral damage. We have names and faces.
Sakia,
Nadim,
Kimani,
Jawahir,
Renisha.
Muhammad.
they burned me alive in Jerusalem.
They gunned me down in Chicago.
They shot our water tanks in Hebron.
They cut off our water in Detroit.
They demolished our homes in the Nakba.
They swallowed our homes in New Orleans.
When I see them, I see us.
They see our homes as dangerous, label us demographic threats. They sterilize us without our knowledge.
Mark our children as criminal.
We say no to all forms of oppression, in U.S. cities or on Palestine streets.
We respect the uniqueness of our struggles and our varied histories.
When I see them, I see us. determine, I see who we were meant to be.
Alive, free, liberated.
Mapping out our destiny.
I see hope,
Strength.
Love.
A place where our children can dream.
I see a road.
a partner,
A family.
a world where we can rise and be seen.
All right, if we can keep the lights down, one more very brief video.
Bernie
When it
Sanders
comes to the
is a
Israeli-Palestinian
rare
conflict-
politician in America who I probably agree with over 90% of the time, maybe upwards of 90%.
Get a check from Bernie Sanders. Very small check.
It feels like it's always the same story.
Israel launching an airstrike. Palestinian teenager was shot and killed by Israeli soldiers.
A settler couple were driving in the north of the West Bank when they were shot dead.
When a Palestinian or Israeli is killed, it's a tragedy for their family and community. But there's an important part of that story that's usually missing: the occupation. Israel has maintained a military occupation of Palestinian territory since 1967. That's meant Israel has taken over Palestinian lands and built settlements on them for its population in violation of international law. Israel also heavily restricts the movement of Palestinians and controls their economy and even water and electricity. Palestinians living under Israeli occupation don't get a vote or a say in the system that dominates their lives. But here's the bottom line: violence is an inevitable result of occupation. The killings, the clashes, the stabbings, the home demolitions, the checkpoints, the night raids, the rockets, none of these things happen in a vacuum. Israel has displaced Palestinians from their land, demolished their homes, and kept them in refugee camps. Whether Palestinians protest violently or not, Israel frequently responds with military force. That's what an occupation is. So, can the violence in the occupied Palestinian territories end without an end to the occupation? Follow the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and you'll hear that settlements are a major sticking point. But what exactly are they?
All right, Eric, can we hit the lights? I wonder if a technical person can help me make this go away. Close it? Good enough. Okay. Years ago, the great black intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois said that most men today cannot conceive of a freedom that does not involve somebody's slavery. That statement is still true today. Freedom defined as free markets, as so-called free enterprise, means exploitation and servitude for those who do not own capital. One alternative is radical freedom. Radical freedom means demanding for all human beings the dignity, the rights, and resources you desire for yourself. It means that my freedom is inextricable from the freedom of all oppressed people. It means that when liberation comes, it must be all of us or none of us. One is reminded of the need for an expansive concept of freedom when one examines the many links between African-Americans and Palestinians. The structures of racial oppression force both African-Americans and Palestinians to live in an almost permanent state of emergency and crisis. Both African-Americans and Palestinians face merciless state violence. Both face white supremacist regimes rooted in the historical phenomenon of settler colonialism. While Gaza has long been described as one of the world's largest open-air prisons, a virtual police state has transformed many African-American communities into militarized zones of detention, surveillance, and punishment. African-Americans and Palestinians are routinely criminalized, portrayed as violent, in need of pacification. The forces of occupation deploy many of the same military techniques and materiel to subjugate and contain the two peoples. In some cases, the same security companies are involved in the repression. In recent years, Black Americans and Palestinians have again drawn explicit connections between the struggles of their peoples. During uprisings against police terrorism in Ferguson, some Black activists expressed support for Palestinian resistance to Israeli apartheid, while some Palestinian activists in the West Bank issued solidarity statements of their own, providing advice, for example, on how to cope with tear gas attacks. Last year, thousands of Black students, workers, activists, intellectuals, and artists signed the Black Palestinian Solidarity Statement. It said, quote, "We choose to join one another in resistance, not because our struggles are the same, but because we each struggle against the forces of structural racism." Such expressions of solidarity are essential for movement building and for understanding the global reach of racism. The politics of solidarity is not about claiming a perfect symmetry between Black America and Palestine. No such symmetry exists, and no political analogy is perfect. But the Black Palestinian analogy is extremely useful. It reminds both African Americans and Palestinians that we are not isolated minorities. Indeed, we are part of the global resistance to oppression and white supremacy. The historical relationship between African Americans and the State of Israel is complex. Before and after the founding of Israel in 1948, many Black leaders supported Zionism, seeing the movement as an expression of the Third World quest for self-determination. Relatively few Black observers condemned the dispossession of Arabs at that time. In subsequent years, however, many African-American progressives and internationalists came to recognize Zionism as a form of colonialism and to regard the State of Israel as a settler colony engaged in the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Now, more than ever, the Black liberation struggle, indeed all the forces of anti-racism, need the political clarity that such analysis provides. The corporate media and political establishment routinely portray Israel as a vulnerable victim rather than a powerful military aggressor. Control of the political thought of American civilians is necessary to justify massive U.S. aid to Israel and to continue the policy of shielding Israeli human rights abuses from the condemnation of the world. However, anti-colonialists and anti-racists recognize the Palestinian struggle as a struggle against colonialism, apartheid, and occupation. They know that there can be no peace without justice. They understand that freedom and justice in Palestine and Black America mean ending all forms of white supremacy throughout the world. They also understand the need for moral courage. Anti-racism does not mean speaking out when it is convenient or comfortable or expedient. Anti-racism requires permanent, principled engagement with the forces of racism and colonialism. Freedom does not mean accepting the received wisdoms of the powerful. It means independent thought and analysis. It means dissent. It means exercising our democratic right to stand with the oppressed. It means speaking truth to power, despite attempts by defenders of the status quo to suppress the conversation. Genuine anti-racists thus reject the equation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. This, of course, is a long-standing strategy for smothering critiques of the occupation of Palestine. Many of the planners of tonight's program, some of whom you will meet shortly, are staunchly committed to an agenda of anti-racism and anti-colonialism. They are part of a multicultural, multiracial effort to prepare young people for critical thought, to build solidarity on behalf of the oppressed. They insist upon the right to oppose racism, colonialism, and militarism wherever they appear. Their effort to stifle this discussion and similar campus conversations reflects the corporate domination of our education system. The neoliberal university is not designed to prepare young people for critical thought or independent analysis. It is designed to prepare them for efficient management of global capitalism and compliance with the existing order. Overcoming such moral paralysis requires that we find our voice. I'd like to briefly introduce 3 people who have found theirs. And these 3 organizers will make very, very brief remarks before we introduce Reverend Hagler. Beth Harris, Beth, can you raise your hand? Is a member of Jewish Voices for Peace. She took her first action against racial discrimination in grade school in Indianapolis, Indiana, where there were rules and norms that excluded both blacks and Jews from certain spaces in civil society. Her activism against Israel's occupation and the violation of Palestinian rights began in 1995 when she was the chairperson of her Jewish synagogue's Social Justice Committee in Seattle, and Israeli peace groups warned that the expansion of Jewish-only settlements and the demolition of Palestinian homes were foreclosing opportunities for peace. Hadiya Chowdhury is a member of Students for Justice in Palestine. She got involved with anti-racist work in the fall of her freshman year through SJP. Her sister was always very aware of race and gender and class issues when she was growing up, and she was thus inspired to start the work. And also growing up in an overwhelmingly white environment sensitized her to the need to speak out against racism at home and abroad. Finally, Amber Aspinall is a member of Black Students United. Amber. As a black queer woman, Amber felt compelled and feels compelled to engage in social justice and to push for the liberation of our communities. To continue as well the black radical legacy of resistance. Since coming to campus, she's been engaged in many modes of activism. She's a TA in the Cornell Prison Education Program, and she's a proud member of Wanawake Owari Cooperative. So first we'll have some brief words from Beth, Hadiya, and Amber, and then we will bring on our main speaker, Reverend Hagler.
As a member of the National Board of Jewish Voice for Peace and the local Ithaca chapter, I would like to thank the Africana Center and all of the co-sponsors for hosting this very important event. And I would also like to thank Reverend Graylan Hagler for coming to Ithaca and sharing his important experience and perspective. Now, it may not surprise you that Jewish people disagree about some things. And that includes the role of race, ethnicity, and religion in legal and political systems. For some Jewish people, the lesson of the German genocide against the Jews in Europe is that we cannot depend on equal rights in order to secure our safety and freedom. What we must have is a political majority that is maintained through military might, even if this requires the violation of rights of others who are in the territory that we seek to control. This position supports Israel's permanent military, political, and economic domination of the Palestinian people as necessary for Jewish survival. While I understand the fears that drive this perspective, I disagree. As survivors, I think we have a collective responsibility, and that is to resist oppression against all groups of people, including the Palestinians, who have been denied their fundamental human rights and political freedom. We must oppose laws and political institutions that put some people outside the protection of law due to their race, ethnicity, religion, or economic status. And we must create a solidarity with all of those who are oppressed for their human dignity. There is a link between the oppression of Jews, the history of the oppression of Jews, and the exclusion of Palestinians and African-Americans from the protection of their fundamental human rights today. My organization, Jewish Voice for Peace, nearly doubled in size in the wake of Israel's war on Gaza in the summer of 2014, when 2,100 Palestinians were killed and 66 Israeli soldiers and 7 Israeli citizens. That means that more than 96% of those killed were Palestinians. This was not an equal fight. During this slaughter, Rabbi Brant Rosen reworked the first chapter of Lamentations, and I'm just going to share a short segment. All along the roads is mourning. The teeming marketplaces have been bombed into emptiness. The only sounds we hear are cries of pain, sirens blaring, drones buzzing, bitterness echoing into the vacuum of homes destroyed and dreams denied. We have become Gaza's master, leveling neighborhoods with the mere touch of a button for her transgression of resistance, her children born into captivity. They know us only as occupiers, enemies to be feared and hated. We have lost all that was once precious to us. This fatal attachment to our own might has become our downfall. This idolatrous veneration of the land has sent us wandering into a wilderness of our own making. May our time together tonight, connecting the dots, help us find a way out.
I'm here on behalf of Cornell Students for Justice in Palestine. And because we're talking about occupied territories, I just think it's important that we first realize that Cornell is on occupied Hagler land. So I don't have quite as much to say. Thank you, Beth. That was really beautiful. I just wanted to thank the Reverend for coming here today to speak to us. SJP was really happy to be able to work with Professor Rickford to get you here. And basically, on a primarily Zionist campus, what we aim to do is educate people and raise awareness about this issue. And I think that linking it with Black solidarity is a really, really great way to do that and kind of bring it home. So I'm not going to say much more. Thank you so much for coming, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Hi, everybody. Similarly, I'm going to keep it short. My name is Amber, and I'm a junior in the ILR school. I'm the political action chair for Black Students United. I think I'm going to use my time to give kind of an update on some of the things that BSU has been working lot of our demands had to do with changing the campus culture, so getting more faculty of color, more students of color, and the like, getting a commemoration for the old Africana building. But one thing that we did focus on was private prisons and Cornell's investment in the prison industry. I'm sure many of you are aware of Columbia's successful divestment campaign, University of California's successful divestment campaign. We're looking to make Cornell the next one on the list. So has anybody in here been to the Johnson Museum? Show of hands? Yeah, so that security system is G4S, and it's been like that for a while, and that was a part of our demands that we delivered back in November. Luckily, the contract for G4S is up for renewal in 6 months, 6 months from November, so that puts us at about May and June. And according to the administration, they are working with us to try to get that switch to a different security system. We're going to continue to put pressure on them. We're going to continue to hold them accountable. So unfortunately, I have no other updates on that other than the word that they've given us with their most recent meeting. But at least it's on their radar, something that was not on their radar a while ago, even though these are things that folks have been talking about way before I got here. So be on the lookout for a successful contract change with them.
I'm so proud of our young people that are learning to speak truth to power. I suspect the Reverend is proud as well. Reverend Graylan Hagler is the senior minister of the Plymouth Congregational Church of Christ in Washington, D.C. Reverend Hagler has repeatedly spoken out against U.S. law enforcement's long tradition of dehumanizing African Americans, the police treatment of black neighborhoods as occupied territories, and the role of Israel in the militarization of police in the U.S. Born and raised in Baltimore, Reverend Hagler has praised young people from Baltimore to Palestine who protest police and military brutality and occupation and denounce their political leaders' failure to address institutional barriers to economic opportunities and political empowerment. Reverend Hagler is a co-signer of the 2015 Black Solidarity Statement with Palestine. Known for leading a courageous, social justice-oriented ministry, Reverend Hagler has always connected the dots between struggles against oppression within and outside the United States. He took a leading role in struggles against segregation of public housing in South Boston and against apartheid in South Africa. He served on the steering committee of United for Peace and Justice, which works to end war and oppression and to shift resources toward human need. He's now involved in a campaign to support Washington National Airport workers in their struggle for a living wage, among many other campaigns. We're very fortunate to have Reverend Hagler with us, and a quick reminder that Reverend Hagler will also speak tomorrow, 5:30 to 7 p.m. at GIAC Gymnasium, 301 West Court Street, here in Ithaca. Also, if you're interested in continuing the conversation about Black-Palestinian solidarity, please be sure to sign the sign-in sheet that is circulating and will be circulating. Among the future events being planned is a community read of Angela Davis's new book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Hagler.
Good afternoon, all. And I want to thank Dr. Rickford for his introduction and the whole team for all that you have done to allow me to be here today, to come from Washington, D.C., here to Ithaca, New York. And I got to say, you know this subject must be important because the date is my birthday and I'm here. That for me is the way you spend birthdays. You mark milestones trying to get something done and open up some new vistas in which people can see the world with different lenses. I'm no spring chicken. I've been around a little while. I turned, how old did I turn today? 62. But I raised that issue up because it was interesting. I was talking in the hallway, and in 2014, January, we took a delegation to Israel and the West Bank. And that delegation was a black delegation made up of folks like me and the former director of Trans-Africa, Bill Fletcher, and a number of word artists and spoken artists, and we went there under the auspices of the Jimmy Carter Center. And what was important was that each of us came from different places, from the academic arena, myself, a preacher, one that had been engaged long-term, Bill Fletcher, a unionist and human rights worker, and Jasiri X, and if you have not seen his video that he actually filmed while he was with us called Checkpoint, you can find it on YouTube. You should check it out because he walked around with his camera like this the whole time we were there picking up footage, and I kept getting worried that he was going to get busted walking around filming stuff that folks were suspicious and didn't want filmed. And then we also had a young woman with us from who was a native of Rwanda and had the experience of obviously the genocide of Rwanda, and now was with us to look at this with different lenses. It was one of those telling events, and I'm telling you about the configuration of the delegation because I want to define how black eyes and black minds, salted with experiences of race and racism in the United States of America and in the world, perceived and understood the situation stepping on to Palestinian soil, stepping on to and into the occupied territory. Like I said, most of the delegation was young. And a couple of us, like Bill Fletcher and myself, had long-term experiences participating in movements that engaged nations and people in their aspirations towards freedom. I was one that was a part of the Free South Africa movement in Boston and manned a picket line for over 2 years as we tried to deal with the Cougaron and getting the Cougaron out of the United States of America. That was part of my experience. So some of us were long-term activists and some had just come into it and were seeing for the first time. What was interesting about this is that as we walked around, on the second day, it was interesting how all of a sudden everybody started saying, you don't need to explain to me what's going on. Because where people were coming out of, it was too familiar all of a sudden. It was like they had not left some of the neighborhoods that they were rooted in. They were seeing the duplication of the same tactics, the same type of treatment, the same perspective with which those who were in dominance were looking at those in the West Bank who were occupied. I saw that. I felt that. My experience also comes to me because I pastored, as you know, in Roxbury. I don't know if you said that. Roxbury, Massachusetts. Some of you know Roxbury? Yeah, you know Roxbury? And in Roxbury, I was there in the 80s and 90s before I went to Washington, D.C. Now, one thing that being in a little church outside of Dudley Station where Malcolm X ran around, and being in the midst of that neighborhood, I saw firsthand, experienced firsthand the effects the police patrolling the black community. I was there when somebody by the name of Charles Stewart, y'all may not know that name, Charles Stewart took his wife to a Lamont class, birthing class, at Brigham Women's Hospital in the middle of daylight, and all of a sudden killed her, but told the police that he was carjacked by a black man. My church was in the middle of that. My church was in the middle of that, and I knew instantly what was getting ready to happen. Before the news really started sort of crescendoing, all of my women and men were going to be under scrutiny. They were going to be harassed. And sure enough, as I was coming from church one evening, I saw this image that I shall never forget. Riding down Dudley Street, going home, all of a sudden to see 15 to 16 black men up on the wall with their hands in the air like this, and with their pants down around their ankles so that their genitalia was showing, and the cops were laughing and pointing guns at them. I knew at that moment enough was enough.
I began to organize against the police at that point, against their illegal tactics. But again, what I'm saying is that snapshot, I saw that all of a sudden in the West Bank. I saw that same thing that I had struggled against years earlier in Roxbury going on as a daily routine in the West Bank, and as people were being harassed because of what they looked like and who they were. You see, these tactics, one, have been going on for a long time, and as Dr. Rickford pointed out, it is a worldwide phenomenon. A worldwide phenomenon of law enforcement and military controlling those who are poor, those who are oppressed, those who have been dispossessed, denying people rights and justifying it in terms of the language of security. And you know as well as I do, all you got to do is say terrorist today, and somebody refuses to look any further but decide that you're guilty. That's the way it functions in America. That's the way it functions in the world right now. Oh, terrorist act. But who's the terrorist? We got to ask the question, what is terrorism? Is terrorism really a neutral term that is used as a subjective one? And what I mean is that those who create definitions and those who create context, they're the ones that can define who the terrorists are and who the terrorists are not. I remember years ago I was in the Soviet Union before it crumbled. And I was sitting in Moscow, and we decided one night I wasn't going to go with my delegation to the ballet because I was kind of tired. And so I sat there, and all of a sudden in the lobby, there was a guy trying to get my attention. And you know how it is, you're in a strange place, and you know you really don't know anybody, and why is somebody signaling you like that? And so I turned around, did the normal thing, and looked. It turned out to be a Palestinian at Patrice Lumumba University, and we started talking. And before it was over, he got on the phone and he started calling all the Africans up who were studying at Patrice Lumumba University and all the Palestinians up. And so by the time my delegation came back, we were about 20, 25, maybe 30 strong in the room. And so of course now my delegation wanted to know what was going on. And so one of the guys who was a Lutheran minister came over and he said, introduce your friends to us. And I said, I didn't know the name, right? I said, well, they can introduce themselves. and so they introduced him. And when he got to the guy that first drew my attention, the Lutheran minister looked at him, and he looked at the Lutheran minister, and he said to the Lutheran minister, so you're a terrorist? And the Lutheran minister got all red in the face. He says, I'm not a terrorist, I'm an American. And he says, and your bombs killed my sister. Again, it's where you stand, at what time you stand, is how you see the world and understand what is going on in the world. In Roxbury, I saw the use of dispossession, right? You can have a separation wall around Bethlehem, or you can have a wall of segregation around Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan. Just like you can have a wall of separation around most of Washington, D.C. right now, where as you have poor communities that cannot break out of those poor communities, and those are economic walls that are in place versus a physical wall. But I'm saying all this to try to get us to understand that there is a correlation that exists in terms of the occupied territories, or occupied Washington, D.C., or occupied Boston, Massachusetts, or occupied Chicago, or any of those places around the world. We understood when we get to Bethlehem, there's this amazing wall. Donald Trump. Can't call his name too well. But that guy, y'all know that guy is preaching racism, right? He talks about how a wall has been built by Israel. And that's what he wants to build, a wall like that on the southern border to keep those who are from Mexico out. Same kind of mentality. If you see the wall around Bethlehem, the wall looks like a prison wall. A prison wall. Meanders all through Palestinian territory and very often onto Palestinian land. A prison wall with sniper towers on it. Barbed wire in many cases. I happened to be in Bethlehem on Orthodox Christmas. Can you imagine coming into Bethlehem on Orthodox Christmas and seeing this wall? And I began to wonder, if the three wise men were coming to visit Jesus, they couldn't get through that wall to do so. They would be trapped on the other side because their papers wouldn't be in place. They wouldn't have the proper permits to make the journey. That's the wall. Bethlehem, the storied place of Jesus, is surrounded and cut off. I went back from 1974 when I first went to Israel to 2014. I went back to a store to buy souvenirs in Manger Square. And when I was there in 74, the guy's father ran the place. And we started talking. And one of the things that he was complaining about was that it was the high season. This just shows you what the impact. It was the high religious season. And he could not get a permit to leave Bethlehem to go and pick up supplies in Jerusalem. And so there he was, stuck with an emptying store. The kind of relationship that exists. Bethlehem, again. This wall that stood. It reminded me of our penal system in the United States of America. Our penal system in the United States of America that over 30 years ago had only about 300,000 people in it. But today boasts of more than 2 million black and brown people in it. We carry the highest incarceration rate in the world in order to control the population. The prison wall, or the separation wall, makes it clear that the West Bank is probably the largest open-air prison ever built. I know people say that about Gaza. When you talk about land mass, and you see this meandering wall that controls water, that controls movement, that controls resources, you begin to realize that by all means and purposes, the people who are inside that wall that is controlled by the Israelis are indeed in prison. They're living under the shadow of the wall, living under the shadow of a military that is an occupying force, that is controlling and defining life and defining future and defining hope. Our black delegation from the United States had already experienced in our lives the histories and current brutalities and limitations imposed by the American racial system. A racial system that's overt and covert at times, visible and not readily or easily seen at times. It keeps blacks in their places, no matter how it is framed. It keeps blacks in their place, it thoughts political potential, and clearly declares that though we may consider ourselves as one of the hyphens of African-American, it is actually not our land. It is not our government. It is not our economic system, nor are its policies designed for us. It is with these kinds of eyes and this kind of sensitivity informed by historical and racial injustice and from our own personal experience with racism that we stepped onto Palestinian soil. We saw sites that were historical, sites that were biblical, sites that were embroiled in conflict and that were sacred to the three Abrahamic faiths. And yet it was also unholy and broken in its current historical context. What was interesting to me was that I had this picture in my mind from 1974 when I was 20 years old and I could get on a bus and go from Jerusalem to Bethlehem or En-Gedi or up to Nazareth. Just travel around, get on a bus, grab a cab, and just go. And then to come back in 2014 and to see such militarization at every turn, arms at every place, the kinds of scrutiny and paranoia that existed, where everybody that did not look like they were Jewish was a suspect and would be stopped and harassed. I was in Hebron, and some of y'all know the story of Hebron because in the 80s there was a massacre in the mosque in Hebron, where one of Mayor Kahani's disciples went into that mosque and opened fire doing worship and killed numbers of women, men, and children. I went to that mosque, and then on the other side there is a synagogue. And so I went to that synagogue, and I looked around to see what was going on. And I walked through the park across the street and looked at all the plaques of all the folks who had donated money in order to support the park and support that synagogue. And then it dawned on me that as I went to that park and walked around and looked at the synagogue, that when I arrived there was one armored vehicle. And now there were 5 armored vehicles. And they were all looking in my direction. I'm from Baltimore, so I know it's time to step off. and step off slow so that you don't look like you're running from something. And I went and I slowly wandered back to find my delegation. And just as I found my delegation, a platoon of these folks came running at us with their automatic weapons, pointing at us, screaming for our papers at the top of their lungs. I've told this story before. And there I am. I'm standing there with my delegation. And I got my hand on my passport here. And I'm holding it. I can feel its pages. My delegation produced their papers. My arm would not move. I don't know if it was because I was being resistant to what was going on, or there was some kind of post-traumatic stress that was going on in me, but my arm wouldn't move. And now I'm the only one that hasn't produced the papers, and the guy is sitting there and he's shaking his gun in my face, and he's saying, papers, papers. And I knew I couldn't incite him, so I couldn't really have an argument. The man had a gun. And so the only thing I could think to say was, why? And to my surprise, he answered me. He said, because Arabs are not allowed on this road. And with that, he kind of broke my ice, and I said, well, then you don't need to see my papers. I didn't say it because I'm not Arab, but I said, then you don't need to see my papers. But he said it in pretty good English, and so I turned around, and then I turned back, and I said, boy, where you from? And he turned out to be from Chicago. And at that point, you know, I said, ain't no way in the world you're going to see papers from me. And yes, I said pimply-faced white boy. I know that folks are going to quote that and quote that. They've been quoting that, but I meant it. He had pimples and he was white. And therefore, I told no pimply-faced white boy from Chicago going to point a gun in my face and expect me to produce papers. You better shoot me right now. And I turned around and I walked away. And my God, I got away with it. My delegation was scared to death and shaking, and they wanted to fight with me afterwards. But I told him, I said, remember this, because I had an American passport, I had a little bit more power than a Palestinian would have had. Because a Palestinian would have been shot down for doing the same thing that I did. The fact is that God's grace was with me, and I was able to walk away from that. But sisters and brothers, I vowed that from that moment on, that everything that happened to me in the West Bank and in Israel, I was going to have to resist with every fiber of my being. Because I realized that one thing. There's a relationship between the racism that is going on in Palestine and the West Bank and Gaza, perpetrated by the Israeli government against those people. There is a racism, but I also know this, is that racism is a cancer. If you don't resist it, it will eat you up. If you don't challenge it over here, you're going to meet it over there. And so nobody can be exempt from this kind of racism that exists. What I saw there was the continued colonialization of Africa, for example, or the extermination of native people from the soils here in America, because somebody always arrived, just like they arrived in the Zionist argument and said, as they came out of World War II in Europe, the argument was simple. I call it the Columbus argument. And the Columbus argument is, we're a people without a land, and Palestine is a land without a people. Just like folks did not recognize native culture in this country or in the Americas, but felt that they had a right to take it and not to coexist. You see, the issue is that we got to begin to try to look at the world through different lenses. We got to challenge injustice wherever it is, or it will truly eat us alive. Look at what's going on right now here in the United States of America. You know, the fact is, I am enjoying Donald Trump. I'm going to tell you why I'm enjoying Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump has stripped away any illusion of what conservative politics is about. Conservative politics has always been the politics of white supremacy. It has always been that. It always will be that. And the fact is, when you come to Washington, D.C., and what is called the Conservative Political Action Committee meets every year, all of those organizations have historical patterns of being connected to the Klan or to the posses out there, to the militia. They all, and they're dressed up in suits and they look good, and the press goes down there to see them, and every single Republican politician goes down there to make a speech to CPAC. It is white supremacist organizations. That's what we're encountering in the world. This resurgence, not really resurgence, but now an exposed white supremacy. I was on a talk show the other week, and I was having this conversation with this conservative. Well, what the conversation turned into a shouting match, so let's be honest about it. Right? And one of the things that he was complaining about, he was saying, we're sick and tired, meaning whites are sick and tired of being politically correct. And I know you've heard that argument before. And I looked at him and I decided that I was going to talk about his mama a little bit. But not in a negative way. But I said it this way. I said, I don't know who your mama was or how your mama raised you. But my mama taught me to be respectful of everybody. To treat people with dignity, respect, and care. And it seems to me that that is being politically correct. And so I don't know what your mama taught you since you want to go out and call me maybe the N-word. I said, if you slip up and do it, I'm going to knock you on your butt. The issue is, we got to stop having the kinds of intellectual conversations with ignorance. And also the issue is that we got to stand up, and we got to challenge racism and discrimination and hatred wherever it is, and Zionism is racism. We got to stand up and challenge it, sisters and brothers, because the fact is, it is not going to go away on its own unless we, as people of conscience and goodwill, pose some kind of challenge to it. This is like we had to fight South Africa against apartheid. And when I started out battling against apartheid with our South African brothers and sisters, I remember being called into the president's office. I was in school. And he says, you need to leave that mess alone because they're communists. And if you want to keep on doing that, you cannot do it here because they're communists. Well, you know, that was a part of the old argument to dissuade people from being engaged with the freedom movement in South Africa because they were, after all of them were communists. Or it's like the struggle around Palestinians right now. It gets framed that all of them are terrorists. So if you want to raise up the issue, or this, if you want to raise up the issue about Palestine, then you must be an Israel hater. You must be one who is anti-Semitic and hate Jews. You must be one who wants to dismantle Israel. Well, the issue is, as a person of faith, I don't want to destroy anybody. I don't want to see anybody harmed in any way or capacity. But what I want to do, I want to see people free. I want to see people being able to live as sisters and brothers. I want people to have dignity. I don't want people to have a lopsided kind of justice where you talk about a two-state solution and then you move all these settlers into Palestinian territory and those settlements get larger and larger so that it's a ridiculous argument to keep talking about a two-state solution unless folks pack up and go back to the other side and leave contiguous land to Palestinians. Or the blockade, the thorough blockade that is on Gaza from land and sea and air that keeps people there living at the bare minimum and can bomb people at will, and therefore people can't even get out of the country and people can't even get into the country. Just look at Medea Benjamin and Cole Pink as they were trying to take a flotilla into Gaza, and they just grabbed her at an airport and broke her arm. That's the kind of struggle. I'm going to tell people always come back and say, well, Reverend, you're being anti-Semitic. Well, I'm not. I'm not anti-Arab at all. I'm not anti-Semitic because I'm not anti-Ethiopian because Amharic is Semitic. Or I'm not anti-Eritrean. I am not anti-Semitic because I'm also not anti-Jewish. I am not anti-Semitic. But the fact is I said that because I want to show to you that folks have captured terms and have basically reframed discussion of concepts and changed the narrative so that the narrative is no longer factual because narratives don't have to be factual. Narratives just got to be used and formulated and pushed forward so that people eventually buy into those narratives, such as conservative rather than racist, or the Holocaust. Whoops, there he goes. Y'all remember Sex and the City? Right? and I think it was Charlotte York, the very waspy woman. She was having a conversation with the guy she was dating. I think his name was Goldenblatt. And he was worried about them being exposed in a relationship because his mother, as he said, lost a lot of people in the Holocaust. And there was silence all of a sudden. And so he turned to Charlotte York and he said, well, why the silence? She said, well, you brought up the Holocaust and now I can't say anything else. You see, what I'm getting at is the way things are used is to shut down debate. It's like the Donald Trump syndrome. All of a sudden you want to talk about the political policies of Israel, you're anti-Semitic. Or you're one of those folks that don't believe in the Holocaust. Well, I got news. One of my peeves around the Holocaust is this. There was and is, and don't get me wrong, a Holocaust that happened in Europe. But it's not it's a Holocaust. Because we're standing on soil right now that belonged to somebody else, and they were wiped out as a consequence of it. That was a Holocaust. The Middle Passage was a Holocaust. The rape and pillage of Africa was a Holocaust. All the stuff that has gone on, the chattel slavery that took place in this country for over 400 years, that was a Holocaust. And you see, when we start saying the Holocaust, we are basically are practicing this exceptionalism where you're saying that this is more important than anything else. This is more important than what happened to you. And the fact is those Holocausts that took place are just as devastating and painful to every single group that has been through one. You can't lessen one over the other. But then also, if we're not careful, if we just lean into our pain, and we own our pain, then all of a sudden we start justifying ourselves and our misconduct against others by holding on to our pain. Y'all know what I'm saying? Am I making sense here?
Yes.
You know, all the stuff that black folks have been through, if we held simply on to our pain, we would hate most of you. That's true. Right. It would create a psychosis in us. And so, somewhere along the way, we got to live into our history, but we cannot hold on to anything that happened to us as a justification to do to you what was done to us. You know, we were in a battle in the United Church of Christ. And this was interesting because the United Church of Christ had this thing go on, was that we passed a resolution about Israel and its occupation of Palestinians. And then all across the country, numbers of rabbis that folks had relationships with said to some of those United Church of Christ ministers, we really like you, and you're a really good person, but we really can't sit down with you and have a discussion until y'all change that reprehensible resolution. It was a mild resolution. So we convened a meeting of our partners, Israelis, Palestinians, rabbis, United Church of Christ ministers, and we sat there day after day in a room in Cleveland. And one of the things that came out that I thought was interesting, one of the Israelis on the fourth day screams at this 70-year-old Palestinian woman, who is Quaker, by the way, right? And she keeps saying one thing. She says, I know about all the resolutions. I know about all of the history. I know all that. She said, but what I really know is I got a 5-year-old grandchild that I haven't been able to visit in 5 years. She said, that's what I do know. And she kept saying that over and over again, a very human argument. And finally, one of the Israelis on the fourth day looks at her as she says that again, and he goes, damn it, I'm glad we got the power. I'm glad we got the power so that we can do it to you before you do it to us. I leaned back and I said, wow, there it is. There it is. It was the same thing that I faced when I worked in Mozambique. Was that you had white settlers saying, I'm glad we got the power because we can do it to you before you can do it to us. Well, there wasn't a bloodbath in Mozambique except a bloodbath that South Africa and the United States orchestrated. But it was the same argument in South Africa among the white minority government. Was that we're glad we got the power so we can do it to you before you do it to us. There wasn't a bloodbath for white folks in South Africa. bloodbath for black folks in South Africa, but not white folks in South Africa. I mean, the issue is, and what I'm getting at, is that folks hold on to their pain, and therefore, by holding on to that pain, they do to others what was done to them. And we got to break that cycle. We cannot live caught up in that cycle of you get me, I get you. We can't even live in that cycle because it's psychologically damaging. We got to break beyond it in order to construct a world where people can actually be at peace and live in peace. Because I got news for you. Peace is not just the absence of conflict. It is the presence of justice. It's the presence of justice. And so things have to be decided equally and not lopsided, like they're always being discussed right now. When folks say, oh, the Palestinians don't want to negotiate. Well, the Palestinians walked away because nobody wanted to talk about the right of Palestinians to return. That's an issue. Or how can you have, because they say, well, we're willing to coexist with a demilitarized Palestine. Well, are you going to demilitarize also? Because that's the only way in which you can have equality in that formula, is that everybody decides to lay down arms. Everybody decides to put it away. Otherwise, you still have a lopsided formula. That's the way racism is. It exists in Palestine. It exists in the United States. It is a lopsided formula. But I got news for you. If you want to save Israel, we need to bring Israel legitimately to a table to talk peace. The BDS movement is one way to do it. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. People say it won't work. It worked against South Africa. Mandela walked out of jail because of the boycott movement against South Africa. It also helped to avert a bloodbath in South Africa. You can solve things different ways. One is by economic pressure, because, sisters and brothers, we've had enough guns and enough bloodshed and enough bullets and missiles and rockets and all that other type of stuff. We've had too much of that stuff. It's now time to go another way. And one way that civilian Palestinians are calling for is for the solidarity of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Folks say it won't work. That's why you got Congress voting on anti-BDS bills. That's why you got state legislatures voting to try to take away your First Amendment right on anti-BDS bills, because it is working. It's working around the world. And it's not, let me repeat it one more time, it's not to destroy Israel. It may be the thing that saves Israel, because you cannot walk around armed to the teeth and so militarized and that not affect your psyche and drive you absolutely crazy with your own power and your own sense of privilege and your own sense of purpose, because eventually you're going to die. If somebody understands biblical history, Solomon, great King Solomon, rich King Solomon, by the time he came to the end of his reign, the country was bankrupt and they was getting ready to be a coup d'etat, because he had sold weapons to everybody and he had to have a larger and larger and larger standing army in order to defend himself, and in the end he was broke. And in the end, he couldn't feed nobody. All that militarization will not make Israel any safer. But also, remember this, this is part of the psychosis. You may have heard Netanyahu say, oh, Israel lives in a bad neighborhood. Y'all heard that? I didn't know was he talking about my neighborhood? Right? I mean, what I'm getting at is the racist overtones to that language even. The way it is understood. Because when we talk about, oh, it's a bad neighborhood, lock your door, put your dog in. All that type. It continues to come. If you don't think it's racist, when Netanyahu came and spoke to Congress and avoided the President of the United States because his face was black, he proved that it was racist. As I said to everybody, I said, when I go to a church, you stop by and you ask the senior minister of that church, is it all right for me to be? I don't care if you chair the deacon board if you invite me. It's protocol. It's the right thing to do. And this was a tweak, a smack in the face of the president. Again, because he was a black man. Because folks have disagreed with Israel before. When we were there, some Africans had broken out of prison. And we went to fight. And they were in a work prison, forced labor. And they broke out, and they marched on Knesset, went up to Tel Aviv. We finally caught up with them in Tel Aviv. They were from Somalia, and Sudan, and the Eritreans. And as you can imagine, if you look at the geography, most of them walked there. But Israel will not call these Africans refugees. They're instead called infiltrators. And they're called infiltrators because under international law, refugees should be afforded certain rights. So Israel uses a military term and refers to them as infiltrators. Infiltrators are usually shot. Just think of it. The narrative all over again. That's what is being faced by many people. I look at it almost as this idea when you begin to play word games that we're not going to call you a refugee, though you're a refugee, but an infiltrator, that's like 3/5 of a human being. That was to promote the Southern politician and the delegation of Southern states in Congress by counting slaves, but not giving them the full humanity, because that would open up some new issues of how can you have enslaved those folks who are fully human. There's a relationship between all of this. I know this, is that Black Lives Matter. That's got to be our struggle. It ain't what that dog who's running today got to say. Black Lives Matter. Why does Black Lives matter? Because the world has said that Black lives don't matter. Black lives matter because the world responds as if Black lives don't matter. That is an assertion to the world. But it's also an affirmation to myself, because I got to hear and understand that Black lives matter. I have dignity. I have rights. Even if you don't give it to me, I got it. God gave it to me. God endowed me with it. God has filled me with it. Feet march, hands move, spirit begin to soar, to lift up human rights and dignity and justice. And just as Black lives matter, Palestinian lives matter as well, because it doesn't matter in the scheme of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we must continue to stand and link arms around the world, as it says in the book of Amos, until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. God bless you for taking the time to listen to me this evening.
In order to do this in an efficient fashion, perhaps we will have 3 questions at a time. Please actually ask a question. If you insist on making a statement, please frame your statement in the form of a question to appease me. I'm glad you're having some water at Graylan Hagler. So let's take in the back, and then 2 more in this first batch right there, and also in the back.
My name is Tia. I'm from Israel, and I want to ask, I find my friend as a question, and I'm sorry about my English. My daughter and I, the reason of the war, and the world that closed in Hebron, You can tell the history, but you're from the history department, you know, history don't begin when you want it to begin, it started a little bit before. So before that, my great-grandparents came to Israel 100 years ago, and more than 100 years ago actually, one side. And because of people was, not, I want to say that it's not the same like African-American in the state, because I never heard about an African-American that tried to stab an American because he's not an African-American. And in Israel, that's what happened. So my question is Jewish lives matter. And one more question is about, I don't know, I live in Jerusalem. I used to live in Jerusalem. Last now I live in India. From my living room windows, I can see the next apartment to me. It's in the middle of Jerusalem. I can see the apartment of the Supreme Court judge. His name is Salim Gibran. He's not Jewish, and you can hear it. He's an Arab Israeli. How is it? So you claim for racism, apartheid in Israel?
Well, let me start this way. One reason the assertion Black Lives Matter is uttered, because for the dominant culture, white life automatically matters, right? And so when I talk about the sort of the Palestinian lives matter, it's because in the context in which you exist, Jewish lives obviously matter. When you got settlers that are walking around in the occupied territories, beating, attacking, and shooting Palestinian farmers because they're trying to work their land. You know, there's a different scenario that exists there. And, I mean, I understand what you're saying. Did you live in East Jerusalem or West Jerusalem?
I think it's called East Jerusalem.
You're in East Jerusalem?
Okay. Yeah. So they were for 100 years.
Mm-hmm. All right. And, you know, I mean, one of the things I'm just saying in the midst of all of this is just like you can talk about the neighborhood in which you live and sort of the approach to it. But let's be honest, there was a real wave after the collapse of the Soviet Union of Russian Jews arriving that really seriously, radically changed the body politic and the discussion. And it became more conservative. It became more conservative and more virulent in its opposition.
Actually, it's also after the Ethiopian Jews came.
But I can talk about that because you also had riots when Baltimore was happening. You had riots in Jerusalem of the Ethiopian Jews who were rioting against police profiling that was taking place. They felt in Jerusalem against them. Yeah. Or the kinds of jobs that Ethiopian Jews have, which again sort of really sets up that whole racial paradigm, the lowest rung jobs, or in the military on the front lines, those types of things. Yeah.
Can we take the next...
Thank you, that's good. Thank you.
Can we take the next two questions back to back? Maybe we'll do in pairs, okay? So, yes, in the... Was it? Okay, right there and then in the back. Yes, please.
I just want to preface my question by saying that in my family, my physical, actual family, I'm African-American or biracial, if you want to, cut it up like that. I just say African-American, and my cousins are Jewish, and the rest of the family is Christian. So I do believe that there is hope for Israel and Palestine and for a lasting peace, and that in the United States of America, Black people and the Jewish population have a shared history that is at times contentious and at times closely knit and very positive. And so, again, just a positive, put it that way. So I lived in Bloomington, Indiana. I'm originally from Knoxville, Tennessee. Go Vols. And ended up in Bloomington, Indiana, which is a liberal bastion. It's sort of the liberal citadel of southern Indiana, if you want to put it that way. And I began noticing in the video store that me and my friends would go to, they had taken out the black directors section. So they were taking out, well, this was before the whole Black Lives Matter phenomenon came up. This was around 2010, 2011. And I felt this pressure in this white liberal city for Black people to be pushed out that I ended up moving back home to Knoxville, Tennessee, and then being pushed out of there, firing up to Chicago, where I had gone to college. And then after I'd been in Chicago for about a year, that's when Black Lives Matter really started up. Have you noticed, given your more panoramic view of America's cultural landscape, an increase of racism in liberal institutions or in the liberal mind? I think that Christian America equates Jewish America with liberalism and with liberal stuff and all this crap. And Jews are sort of slowly becoming more matriculated into the Christian mainstream. And I was just wondering if you had observed an increase of racism in so-called liberal communities or institutions or whatever.
Sure, I'm sure I've experienced it. I think it's become more overt lately. And part of this comes out of a couple of things. One is I got a term for like immigrant groups that come into the U.S. Because everybody talks about, oh, we came here and we were discriminated against. But the reality is the groups that came here were discriminated against. That wasn't racism, that was simply what I call anti-feelings. Because a generation later, you have people, in a sense, who are mobile enough that they basically merge their narrative into the dominant white narrative of the country, of course with their own nuances to it. And then they become the oppressors of people of color. And we've seen that over and over and over again. It's like you have Ted Cruz and what's the other boy named Rubio, right? Latinos trying to be white, and they're going to be white, right? They're going to get there. They get there, right? Because they're already there now, trying to oppress everybody. But what I'm getting at is that there's this mobility that takes place and takes shape, and what happens is that even when people think that they're liberal, just like we were talking today, we live in places where we don't know each other. I don't care what we're talking about. There's ghettos after ghetto after ghetto that exist in the United States of America. You got neighborhoods that are still pretty much exclusively white, might be a liberal neighborhood, but still exclusively white. Right? And you got, it's like I always brought out in D.C., it drives people crazy when people say, oh, it's not really racism, it's class. And one thing I can truly say in D.C., so take me to a poor white neighborhood, because it doesn't exist. Right? So it's not class, it's built upon race, but everybody wants to deny racism so that they can feel that they're liberal.
So, given the nonviolent African-American struggle for equality in the United States, do you think it's rather offensive to compare their peaceful tactics with those of Palestinian Islamic terrorists murdering Jewish men? Say
that again, please. You're speaking too fast.
Don't you think it's rather offensive to compare their peaceful tactics with those of Palestinian Islamic terrorists bent on murdering Jewish men, women, and children in the streets? Terrorists who hack one another to death in their home in front of their children, and who fire rockets from the roofs of hospitals and tunnel underneath kindergartens in order to kill their kids.
Good question. But you should have the same outrage when settlers burn up a Palestinian family and then dance about it in a religious service. And what I'm getting at here is that if we're going to advocate for justice and peace, you had better advocate for it all around, right? Because the thing is that we discover, and I'm writing a little chapter right now around the narrative that exists. I was a child of the Westerns, right? Cowboys and Indians. Right? And Indians were bloodthirsty little rascals that were just messing with them poor white settlers and killing them and scalping them. And so nobody wanted to be an Indian, everybody wanted to be a cowboy. And you find out the narrative is the opposite. Is that Indians were fighting off genocidal policies that were destroying their life, their way of life, their history, their family, their cultures, and stealing their land. And so their act was a defensive one because they didn't matter to the dominant culture. Remember this. When people very often respond with violence, it's because nobody's listening. Nobody's listening. Nobody's acting like they're listening. And nobody's acting like a life matters. That's what I'm talking about. We got to break that cycle that goes on. When the stuff blew up in Baltimore, it was because nobody was listening. Nobody was listening, and politicians had not cared. I grew up around there where Freddie Gray was killed, was locked up and killed, Sandtown. My grandmother's house was 4 blocks away from there, so I know that neighborhood. I know that neighborhood when there was investment in that neighborhood, and I watched that neighborhood get systematically disinvested from. People didn't matter. There was violence all around, and that particular spark set people off. But it had been going on for years. Nobody was listening. It's time for all of us to listen. That your pain is as important, yes it is, as somebody else's pain. But your pain is no more special than somebody else's pain.
Just a few more. Yes, right there. And let me see who was. Yes.